and welcome to the Industry for Community podcast hosted by myself, Walker D. Reynolds. Our sponsor for this show is the Prove It Industry for Community Conference, Prove It 2025. The response has been simply overwhelming. We're recording this on Monday, June 17th, so we went to wide release today. This will be published on Wednesday, June 19th. We went to wide release today. We have essentially had record response. The venue that we're doing the conference at said that they've never had as many rooms sell in the first week. We are certainly going to be at 50% tickets sold this week for sure, with the early access response we had last week. So if you are interested in coming to Prove It, the Industry for Community Conference, February 18th to the 20th at the Westin Galleria Conference Center in Dallas, Texas, 2025. Please go to proveitconference.com and sign up. We will be publishing some of the sessions via digital media, and I think we're going to have, for those in the EU, we have an announcement for you, and then also we're going to have some of the sessions available like through IIoT and Industry. We're working all those details out. We got a ton of announcements coming out about who the title sponsor is and what who all the vendors are that are going to be doing the Prove It sessions. It's pretty exciting. Those of you in mentorship, remember the next mentorship session is this Friday, 2 days from now, June 21st. And I'm actually not sure who's doing the lesson there because I didn't put it in my production notes. So with that, our guest today is, this is probably a podcast that everyone's been waiting to have. I'm going to talk a little bit of kind of how this even came about. We've got Tom Burke, who is the former president of the OPC Foundation. He's actually one of the founders of one of the visionaries behind the OPC standard, but then also one of the founders of the foundation and its longest running president. I think Tom was and Tom can correct me, but he was at the OPC Foundation 29 years.
Long time.
Tom's an electrical engineer and an executive. I'm going to go over his background because it's really important. I don't normally actually do this, but Tom started out at Rockwell back in the early days of Rockwell. So May of '84 was really like Rockwell Automation as we know them today is not what Rockwell was in way back when. So he was actually at Rockwell when Rockwell was really one of the visionary organizations in industrial automation, especially in North America. Then starting in 95, Tom was one of the visionaries and founders of the OPC Foundation. And then over the next 29 years, from 95 until March of 2020, Tom was one of the executive leaders at the OPC Foundation, including 13 years as its president. Today, Tom is the Global Director of Industry Standards for Mitsubishi Electric, and he is the Global Strategic Advisor for the CC Link Partner Association. You may know it as CLPA. And with that, the esteemed Tom Burke, thank you for joining us on the podcast. I'm super excited for this conversation. For those of you who want to know what we're going to talk about, it's really simple. We have 3 segments. What was the original intent of OPC and the OPC Foundation? How has the OPC Foundation lost its way? And, well, what should we do going forward? And I know Tom's working on some stuff behind the scenes. I don't know whether we're going to talk about that or not, but Tom's working on some stuff behind the scenes that I think is long overdue in the industry. So with that, Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Walker. I really appreciate the opportunity to, connect up with you and do this. And it's been long overdue for a lot of reasons. So, and it's funny, the whole Prove It conference, the fact that it's in Dallas, what you don't know is the history of OPC. When we first started, Dallas became our home for so long because it was the pivotal point for a bunch of our small companies that weren't that small to work together when we first started OPC. So I knew Dallas inside and out for a lot of reasons. So it was just a long history.
Well, hopefully I can announce this. I haven't actually announced this publicly, but we have talked to Tom about joining us at the Prove It conference and sitting on our fireside chat. We are tentatively working out all the details. Tom has tentatively committed to do that. I know he's on board for it. We just have to finalize all the deals where Tom's going to come and be part of the fireside chat. And my goal is to have that chat be myself, Rick Bellotta, Matt Paris, and Tom Burke, or if we can't do Rick, we would do Arlen Nipper. So that would be like the perfect fireside chat. So Arlen Nipper, the co-inventor of MQTT.
And you and
Let's
I are
talk.
good friends. Go on.
Let's talk real quick how this came about. So Rick Bellotta reached out to me behind the scenes and was like, "Hey, Tom Burke, you really should talk to Tom Burke, who was the." And I said, "Hey, I know Tom. Tom probably doesn't remember me, but I know Tom from way back in the day, very early in my career." And I said, "I'd love to talk to him." And so Tom and I had a conversation. I think we started this 2 weeks ago, right?
Yeah,
We did a
something like
pre-production,
that,
talked
right?
about what we
Yeah.
do, and then we made it happen. So let's start before we get into what was the original intent of OPC and the OPC Foundation. Let's start with, why did you reach out? What was what are your goals from a conversation for the community?
Walker, I am like seriously committed to interoperability, and I really live and breathe this whole concept of, and I use the words, everybody knows. Tom always says success is measured by the level of adoption.
Yeah.
And so that's the key. When you go do anything with industry standards, they got to be worth more than the paper they're printed on.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity to watch some of your previous podcasts, and I've been watching the stuff on Discord and watching the stuff on LinkedIn. And it's just like, you know what? I got to do something here too. I owe the industry, kind of where my head's at and what we're trying to do. Rick and I have known each other forever. I mean, because he was one of the first guys that thought I was crazy when we started OPC. And he was, still engaged with Wonderware at that time. And I said, we're going to make this successful. And I had met with a lot of people when we first started OPC. And, I just watched what you were doing, Walker, and it's like, this is good, because this is what somebody needs to do, something to shake up the industry and make sure, that we're doing the right things. I mean, both for the suppliers and, more importantly, the end users. I participate in a lot of other standards organizations. And, it's very important that these things are real, that people aren't just meeting for the sake of meeting. And, you're doing a good job shaking things up. And I think that's really cool. And I
Awesome.
think that's what's important. And, I want to partner with you and talk about this and move forward.
I appreciate
That was
it,
my
man.
motivation, to be honest with you.
It's funny, in our community, you've obviously know who Matt Paris is, who's with
Yep.
GE Hire. He writes a lot of, he spends a lot of time. Like, I feel like for a non-OPC guy, I use OPC all the time, especially in L1 and L2. I've been, to me, my first introduction to OPC was Kep Server in 2001 or 2, right? That's
Okay.
so for me, OPC in my brain has always been Kep Server, sort of the standard, right? It's a data aggregator that's foundational. Yep. OPC, DA, and then UA was its foundation, right? And
got it.
I feel like I know the standard really well. I've read every part multiple times. I inside and out. I've spent a lot of time trying to find products that are compliant with each of the parts and companion specs and stuff. But Matt Paris is a guy who he knows it better than me. And for a guy who's not in the OPC Foundation, he knows every, he really has studied.
Time. Between you and him, you've both taken the time necessary. So, I know you guys know what you're talking about. I mean, I know OPC very well for obvious reasons, right? I had to, but you guys know it well. And it's always a pleasure to work with people that know what they're talking about. I'll be honest with you. Versus the people that, are disconnected, right? They think they know what it is, but they don't,
So let's start with, all right. So you're with Rockwell, right? You're you're a decade in, and you're like, hey, well, obviously what was missing in the mid 90s, there was no thought to interoperability. I mean, in 95, when OPC started, I was using a Pentium 75 PC that still talked over a dial-up modem, right? There was no Ethernet at that time. There was no, there was no Ethernet in the consumer side. So what was the original intent? Like, how did you even start? Where did that even come from?
And I've been asked, I've written a lot of things over the years, right? And, obviously I've done, webinars and different recordings, but let me tell you why OPC started. It was pretty simple. I mean, At the time when we were doing this, Rockwell was in acquisition of a company called ICOM out of Milwaukee, out of West Allis, which is near Milwaukee. And they were a really good, software company. But they were, I mean, Scott Ziffer, who was the president, I mean, they had beer taps all over the place. They had everything, that was different in the industry, so foreign, because, at the time I came from Allen Bradley, Rockwell, a very conservative company. And so we had, been in the acquisition of ICOM, to be our software platform, and they did all the programming software necessary for Rockwell PLCs. And we had our own programming software, but we started talking about, and when we brought Scott in, he said, Tom, what do we do here? And, here I am just doing, all things related to, how do we get better interaction? And he said, I want to be, the company, then we want to compete with Wonderware. And that was what he wanted to do. And so the thing was, we knew we had what was known as the Rockwell Software Server Toolkit, and it was about companies writing drivers that allowed Rockwell software and ICOM software to be able to communicate to non-Rockwell devices. And so we're marketing, and matter of fact, that was one of my jobs. I developed that thing, and one of my jobs was to make this thing successful, right?
Mhm.
And I said, we just don't have, enough ability to do this. And Wonderware had a very big, channel. They had a company called Standard Automation in Houston, and a good friend of mine came from there, Rich Malina, who got involved in early OPC. And, him and I were talking, and he said, is there any way we can partner with some companies that we can really, get a standard for moving data from all these different disparate devices and networks into Rockwell software? And I said, what we got to do? We got to partner with other companies. So at the time, I knew the guys at Opto
Was
22.
that decision partnering with other companies? So you hadn't decided to go open yet, but you were probably thinking about it. Was it a function of labor, or was it a function of know-how, or what was the reason? The conclusion was we got to partner with other companies.
The conclusion was, in order for us to be successful, Rockwell couldn't do this with our Rockwell Server Toolkit.
Excellent.
We needed to have more industry recognition, Walker. It was simple. Even before the word collaboration started coming out of my mouth, which is, the word I say all the time, it became so important that we had to find some companies. And, I worked with, the guys at Rockwell, and I said, here's the companies I think we ought to go partner with. I actually wanted to partner with Wonderware at get-go to begin with, too, because Wonderware had the biggest market for something called fast DDE.
Yeah.
Rockwell had advanced DDE, so I'm really dating myself. People don't even know what DDE is,
Well, it's
right?
funny. The first unified namespace was built on dynamic data exchange.
Exactly, exactly. So, and we were doing stuff that it was okay, but and we were trying to make this thing high performance. So the theory was, let's go partner with some companies, and we partnered with Illusion at the time. We partnered with Opto 22, and we partnered with Fisher Rosemont, who now is Emerson, right? And we reached out to some other companies too. There was a company called Intuitive at the time, and they really weren't involved, enough. But there were 5 companies that were made up the OPC task force. So it was Rockwell Software, it was Involution, it was Opto 22, and Fisher Rosemont, and Intuitive. And we just decided, how can we do this and how can we work together? And, there were some legends at Involution, a guy named Al Chisholm. Him and I became really tight and
Yeah.
best friends. Uh, obviously I knew, Steve real well from, Involution at the time. And the guys at Opto 22, the Engmans, we met and, and moved forward. And Fisher Rosemont, there was a guy named Dave Rabine, and he became kind of my, he knew everything about, the administrative end. And I said, let's go do this thing. And the first document that we put together was OPC Data Access. And it was just the 4 companies. We sat down and we worked on this thing. And we had the doggone thing done in 6 months.
So that was.
Literally.
Is that 95?
That was in 95.
From the original, from those first conversations you had in Houston to when you had DA written, Had you codified the foundation at that
No,
point? It was just
nope.
a collaboration. It was
It was
just
just a collaboration, and we called it the OPC Task Force. We didn't have a foundation yet. We thought about, well, how do we do this thing? And OPC, the whole background is it
yeah.
stood for
Why did you pick OLE for process control? Why did you guys pick that?
because first off, we knew we wanted to address the process control industry
Mhm.
mostly. Okay, and that was where Fisher Rosemont was strong. They own process control,
Right.
and we knew that was where we wanted to target, right? And I had looked at Olay, right? And we talked about the partnership between Excel and Word, and how you could exchange data between the two applications.
And so
Object,
I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to
no,
make sure that for those who don't know OLE, it's basically when you're inside. Think of the best way to think about it is when you're inside of a Windows application. How does one application inside of Windows
you
reference
got it.
another one? Like how can I browse? How can I click file, open file browser? And that's OLE makes all that possible. That's basically and so this is OLE for process control. But go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
Yeah, and it stood for object linking and embedding. And Walker, thank you, because that's exactly what it was. It was a cool technology that allowed you to take an Excel spreadsheet and, Microsoft Word would automatically get updated, right? Because it was all about linking between the two applications and the data. And this was, the kind of thing that we wanted to do going down. We wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to be able to connect up to all these different devices out there. And Rockwell and Involution had their own CAPI toolkit. Makes sense. The Opto 22 guys were just trying to figure out what can we do, how can we sell more IO, and it was just we had a lot of fun. We worked hard. And we played hard, but we got that first standard done, and then we immediately took it to ISA, and then the guy Dave Rabine, who was kind of he was my administrative guy. He knew what to do. He said, we got to go create something. We got to create a foundation, somebody, to really take this thing to the next level and start marketing these things, right? And that was how it started, and we ended up having 7 companies on the board of directors that we formed, and, we invited a lot more, right? I had a very tight partnership with. The only thing that we, kind of regretted at the time, and my background before we started doing OPC, I had done a lot of stuff with Unix because we were doing all kinds of things with, advanced SCADA and things like that. I developed something called the Vista 2000, it was a legendary
Right.
SCADA. Okay, but Rockwell couldn't sell it. It was just a big boat anchor that we couldn't sell. So anyway, but we tied ourselves to Microsoft, and a lot of people said, why did you do that? And it was COM and DCOM, which stood for the component object model. DCOM was its distributed version, but it made sense because we had the backing from Microsoft to help us, and that gave us even more credibility, right?
So I'm gonna run through just a couple of like milestones to give people kind of but so basically, I mean, honestly, I just learned a lot of stuff I actually didn't know. I didn't know the origin story. I knew when OPC started but I didn't know the actual, because that's actually pretty crazy that you think in 6 months you guys create the precursor to the official DA, which like the
Yep.
official DA came out in like 98, right? So isn't it like when the formal version, what we know of as OPC DA,
It
it,
was in,
what
yeah,
it
you're right.
was,
That was the time frame. But in '95, we actually created this thing in 6 months. We
yeah,
took it to ISA, and then we started going and pounding on the door, Walker, to get all these other vendors on board. And you know what? It wasn't an end user driven standard. It was a
right,
vendor driven standard. I
right.
mean, totally. It
So
was rock.
yeah, because
Yeah,
the end user at that point, the end user, I always say this all the time, the end user doesn't know what they don't know, right?
right.
I mean, oftentimes as the experts, it's our job to show them the art of the possible, and you have to show them the art of the possible so that they can start thinking in terms of the possible, right? So
Exactly.
you guys, you create the standard, you bench the precursor to the standard in 6 months, boots on the ground. Obviously you had specific goals, things that you wanted to achieve when it came to interoperability. In 96, you guys, the actual OPC Foundation like exists.
It got
You're shopping,
started then. Yeah.
right? 98, the official OPC DA comes out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then HDA comes out in 01, right?
Yep.
03 A&E comes out, alarms and
Alarm
events.
and events, yeah.
And obviously all those things were driven by the needs of through the vendors, but for the needs of the end user, right?
Yeah.
And when DA came out, you had adoption immediately, right? People
We
started adopting.
immediately got wide adoption because people recognized, crap, this is really good. Because you know what, the whole goal, Walker, and I got to tell you
Yep.
this, when we first started OPC, the idea was that Rockwell would build the best OPC server for Rockwell. And
Right.
everyone would standardize on Rockwell. And Siemens would build the best OPC server for Siemens. Well, what I also didn't realize is we created a cottage industry. I mean, companies started coming out of the
Right.
woodwork,
Yeah.
and actually Kepware, and Matricon and all these other companies, they developed a better OPC
Right.
server than Rockwell did.
I say it all the time. Matricon in Canada, Kepware in Maine, and I would love to have. Now that I think about it, I'd love to do another podcast down the road where we have Tony Payne on, who's now leading Highbite, but we get
Right.
Tony Payne in, and we have this conversation because if you look from 03 when you had A&E come out, there's a 3-year period, and then UA pops,
Yeah.
right?
And I'll talk about how UA got started and
what
why.
was the thought process there? Because obviously you had wide adoption. You even after A&E, I remember when alarms and events came out. Like I remember there was wide adoption of alarms and events. It wasn't nearly as wide as HDA and DA, but there was wide adoption.
A lot of wide adoption of
Right.
of A&E.
Then we go. There's a 3-year period, and the next big thing that comes out is UA. Where did unified architecture come from?
Well, so let's got to put a couple other things in the works there. So when 9/11 happened, we were at ISA in Houston, and I can still remember this well. We had announced something called OPC DX, which was OPC Data Exchange. And this was the ability for us to take data from different PLCs, take Siemens, take Emerson, and take Rockwell, and be able to have horizontal communication. So I kept thinking about different ways we could use OPC. Like you said, DA was successful, HDA was successful, but again, I went to Matricon. I mean, Pat Kennedy, he thought I was crazy at the time at OSI. He said, okay, I get it, Tom. And he became one of my best mentors, in a lot of ways, God rest his soul. And, so that was a good thing with OSI, and that's why HDA became successful, because I had companies like OSI Soft that were behind it.
Right.
And that made a big difference, and you had to have the right vendors, Walker, and that's what I learned. You always had to have the small ones and the big ones, endorsing and adopting the standard. And, I got a bunch of little stories that I'll tell as we go through this, but we had also created a standard called XML DA. Yep. And it was the DA equivalent.
Which, by the way, is one of my favorite standards from the OPC Foundation, believe it or not. And Siemens, the Siemens is the one who did it the best, in my opinion.
They did.
Yeah, XML DA runs in their DH445 motion controllers, and it is an excellent way of extracting over OPC XML DA data from motion controllers. And I think Siemens has done a phenomenal job with it.
They
Loved
really
XML
did.
DA.
And again, Siemens and the guys that I partnered with there, I mean, all these guys, I mean, we became such tight friends. It was, but when you live and breathe together, I mean, all of our meetings at the time, I mean, they were all face to face. None of this, we didn't do electronic meetings. We were going to, all over the place. I mean, my airline miles went up dramatically, and I was active in all the meetings deliberately, right? But we had to start expanding, and we had to get more companies engaged, so my biggest job was getting the right companies engaged. And every time the joke was, check your guns at the door, guys, because this is serious. We're going to go do something. And when you're going to go work on a standard, I want your company's commitment that you're going to adopt it too. And that was the thing. We wouldn't let companies that were, we think it's kind of cool, we're going to participate, but we're not going to commit to developing. I said
So
no.
they're on a working group. So they're
Yeah.
on a working group. Well, you guys didn't call them working groups back then yet, did you?
No, we didn't call them working groups formally then. No.
But so you've got these working groups that are designing a new. They're tasked with designing a new part of the standard, or
Or extending it or making
or
it better, right? And addressing needs that we knew, right?
commitment to adoption was a
Was the key.
prerequisite.
It
Was a
was the key.
prerequisite
Yep.
of contribution, right?
Yeah. So,
What happened with DX data exchange? Because people ask me about DX all the time, and I say they want to understand it, and I say, think produce consume tags and rock. You know how Rockwell Automation PLCs can control logics, they can produce and consume to one another. DX, in my mind, I always thought of as it's produce and consume between non-similar vendors PLC. So I produce and consume between a Siemens and a Rockwell PLC. That's how I thought about it, right? But
and all the vendors already had ways of doing this.
right,
My goal was to make it, vendor neutral though, so we could do things between Siemens and Rockwell, right? And at the time when we did the press conference, it was on Tuesday of 9/11. We still went and did the press conference because at the time we were in Houston at ISA. We had no clue. We didn't know what was going on. All we knew is that, somebody said, New York is being bombed, but nobody knew anything at the time. So we went ahead and, we were all stranded there anyway, but we did the press conference. And what I didn't know, Walker, at the time was, I was young and naive. Well, I wasn't young, but I was naive. And, I put this guy, Helmut Gersa from Siemens, and I put Rich Ryan from Rockwell, and then the guy from Emerson. And, I put them all up on stage, right? And, they're all talking about, and I think the one guy said, something, he referenced Star Wars or something. And, it was just crazy. But, the DX, the problem was it was one of the best standards at the time that we developed. It was cool.
yeah,
It was exactly what, we thought we needed, but getting adoption was the hardest part, right? The vendors were like, well, do we really want to invest and put this technology in our controller? And the problem was it was dependent on comms. So you still had to put Microsoft in the controller,
right.
and that was a problem.
Got it.
Okay, so that was the limitation. And, we had
This is where this
XMLDA.
is where UA comes.
And
UA
this is,
comes in.
yeah. And then, well, we met in 2004 and we were trying to figure out, okay, well, we did this for DA with XML. It's the right thing to do. It allows us to have non-Microsoft platforms. So how do we do it for AE and how do we do it for HDA? And I said, and I remember a guy named Jim Luth and we both just sat and looked at each other and said, we got to do something different. We can't do an XML version of this, right? This doesn't make sense. Let's take a step back. And we created, at that point in time, it was the beginning of UA. We started looking at, okay, how do we take this thing? Now, we did have a bunch of things that people used to do with DA, and they wanted to get data, okay? And it was actually a blob, was the way they got data. So there was a standard set of data types that worked well for
Mhm.
everything. But then when you wanted to have structured data, people would start using what was known as the blob, which was part of the standard. So we started taking a look at, well, can we do something different here and create, more of a, way of doing structured data, and that was the beginning of UA. And we knew that UA had to be embedded. I mean, that was the whole goal. I
Right.
wanted to do something embedded. I knew we had to do that because in order to be successful, the best way to get data, when we do exception-based data, but the problem was what we were doing was the server was on the Windows box talking to the devices. What we really needed to do is have the devices who have all the knowledge push it down.
Right.
And that was the beginning of UA. And that's why we did UA, because I wanted to get the doggone thing embedded.
But it took. So how long did it take? So it took 6 months for DA, and then it was 2.5 years later where the actual formal spec comes out. Or two
Yep.
and a half years.
Yeah, it
But
took a while.
it was a 4-year journey with UA. How long was it that first usable? Hey, we've got it. How long was the UA journey? I've heard from behind the scenes it was rough. It was
It
a
was
rough
rough.
period.
And the reason it was rough because we were trying to tackle a lot of stuff and we had a lot of different players. And the problem was we had a lot of different players all having ideas. And, now what I'm trying to do is really get engaged with the MES, right? I'm trying to get engaged with, the IT level now too,
Right.
because not only we are going embedded, and this is when, Rick and a bunch of the guys came out of the woodwork, and we all started working with them very proactively and they thought I was nuts. They said,
Right.
Tom, you're never going to get the IT world to.
Yeah.
What are you doing? How
Well,
in
I
the
mean,
world
and,
you're going
and
to get
for those,
OPC into IT?
for you young people out there, I mean, to think about this in '06, the idea, just the idea that of OT IT convergence, and the idea that you would not have completely segmented process networks and IT networks. And when I say segmented, I don't mean segmented through VLANs where we have the ability to I'm talking air gaps and
Oh,
and and the idea that, I can only imagine they were telling you, dude, there's no way this is going to happen. No one's going to adopt it. No one's ever going to allow you to come up above L2, right?
exactly.
I can only imagine. But what were the primary, like in developing UA? What were the primary issues? Because it's not that when UA came out, it was problematic. I actually thought it was incredibly valuable. I think most people argue it's been incredible. It's been groundbreaking, but it was clearly a labor of love. What was other than the fact that with DA, you just, you adopted DCOM, and then, but with UA, you're basically starting from the ground level up. What were the primary issues that made UA so difficult to implement, and why we waited so long to get it? What was that like?
The biggest problem we had is we had a huge installed base of classic OPC.
Oh, right. Yeah.
There was the problem. And, so how do we take and make sure that, it would have been great. We could have just done a revolution and developed a whole new standard and forgot about classic OPC. That would have been a disaster. We couldn't do that. So we really had to be cognizant of how do we pull forward all the legacy OPC stuff into the new world, right?
And none of the legacy stuff was written thinking that you would ever, that you were, right, that you were
ever go non-Microsoft.
right,
No
that
one,
you're
we
ever going to
never thought of that,
refactor.
right?
Right. Yeah.
We never thought of that. And, so it was a lot of that. It was a lot of all of us working together, and we brought a lot of other companies in, because now I had to get companies involved that were on the other side of the fence. I had to get companies that also developed embedded stuff. Keep in mind, before we were in the Microsoft world,
Yeah.
everything was Microsoft. Everything was based on COM. It was a whole set of vendors there that knew Microsoft very well. But now I'm trying to get companies that are totally outside of, IoT in the IT, and I'm also trying to go down and try and do embedded now. So, it was a whole different types of operating systems, it's a whole different type of stuff. And, it was a big challenge because we're taking on things that we needed the right experts, and bringing these guys in and trying to find the right people. And they were like, remember, my rule was that before, what I didn't also tell you is, as we developed stuff, I had a model that, it drove people crazy. But when we first started OPC Data Access, I said, we have to have sample code. And
Yeah.
our rule was we had to have sample code that, we showed that this thing worked, because we really wanted to develop the code more than the standard. So
Right.
we actually developed DA, we actually wrote the code first. Like when we did the automation interface, which was the VB side of the thing, we
Yeah.
wrote all the code first, and then we documented it into a specification.
This is the biggest issue if anyone asks me about why PubSub has not been widely adopted and why it was so problematic, Part 14. I'm like, I said it was the first standard first part of the standard that I ever actually worked with, where it was built on theory. It wasn't like, you think about it, Randy Armstrong has written most of the code that you now use for Part 14 to get started. But that didn't start in the beginning. That code, that when Part 14 was first released, there was no, Randy's all done that recently in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Most of it. He's done most of it recently. And this has been a huge issue with Part 14. And clearly the foundation or the mindset shifted at some point. Right?
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a question about UA. So UA comes out in 2010. What percentage roughly of those who were using DA, who were obviously going to stay in business, made the jump? I mean, I know all the key players did. Kepware did, Matricon did. Like everybody, most people made the jump. But when in that 2010 to 2015 range, what was your observation? Like, was UA generally accepted? Was there a lot of pushback? Did you see a lot of conversions from DA into UA? Was it parallel adoption, or was it, hey, we're refactoring wholesale and moving to UA? What did that look like
There
in
was
terms of
still
adoption?
there was still a lot of companies that said classic, and I call it classic OPC,
Yeah.
which is DAAE, HTA. It was good enough, Walker, and that was what a lot of the companies said. Why do we need more? This works as is. Tell me what the value proposition of UA is that really wants to motivate why I should invest. And the adoption of UA, because of all the things that are in it, and it's cool.
Yeah.
It's the coolest thing. I mean, there are so much great things in UA, but you know, companies committing behind it, right? Because DA is relatively easy to adopt in terms of, complexity in
Yeah.
comparison to UA.
Yep.
UA's got a lot more. And, the question is, do I need everything that UA puts in? And that's been, part of the issue. So there was a set of companies, that went and they committed and, they jumped on board for UA, right? But not enough. It was still a 90-10,
Yeah.
and what I
I mean,
mean
you
by
had there were 7 parts you had to learn. Like
that,
if you wanted to implement, when UA first came out, that you needed to become fluent in 7 parts of a standard, parts 1 through 7. And then literally the next year, the standard doubled in size. It went to like 13, right up to 13 parts or whatever,
right, because
just a year later.
oh yeah,
Right.
we continued evolving
Right.
because I said, well, here were our initial goals for UA, and we had only done part of it. And I had said when we did UA, Walker was always going to be done in phases. I mean, a good standard
Yeah.
never gets completed because it's got
Yep.
to continue to evolve. It's got to
Iterate.
continue to adapt, right? And you got to fix the things, and you got to, that the purpose for developing sample code was to make sure the doggone stuff worked. It and worked in a way that you could validate this thing. And, if we did have issues, like as you brought up about the pub sub, right? We would have caught it before you release. And that was the thing. I mean, generally, the sample code had to be completed before the release of the specification because you had to have proof that the doggone stuff worked. And, a lot of it was, and Randy's a great guy. I hired him to begin with. I mean, I knew him from day one,
Right.
right? When
OPC, I say this OPC Foundation needs more Randy Armstrongs.
yeah, yeah, we do. And and I tried to find a lot of SDK vendors because and there were a lot of things that I did honestly, Walker, and the board of directors thought, "Are you sure you know what you're doing, Tom?" I mean, like the OPC Foundation, we were making money. It was all good. Life was good. I converted to full-time OPC in 2005 because actually Rockwell between 95 and 2005 paid my salary to work on the standard and run OPC. Jim Luth, he was a full-time OPC person too. We both came on board full-time in 2005, and Randy was already full-time. But one of the things I learned, Walker, was the importance of having the right set of people, working on this thing, right? And that was the thing. And, so we continue to evolve the standard. I preach certification, I preach interoperability. I got to tell you a little story here. So we used to do interoperability workshops, and it was a very important part. We'd get these guys together. An interoperability workshop is a plug fest.
Yep.
And when we were doing this thing, when we first started out in OPC, and I was based in Cleveland at the time where Rockwell was, the first interoperability workshop was in January. And the second one was in January. And let me tell you, Walker, you don't want to come to Cleveland,
No.
in January. It was snow and cold, and these guys were locked in the room for a whole week, right? Testing all their stuff out. The third one we did out at Wonderware in, Irvine at the time, before they moved to Lake Forest, so we got smarter. But, the whole business of you had to do the interoperability, you had to certify, we had to make sure that when you develop one of these products, because I couldn't afford to get, bad credibility out there. So if you got an OPC product, two OPC products, and they don't work together, who gets blamed? OPC.
OPC, and that's the situation the foundation is in right now. Is the primary complaint is that if you see OPC on board on a product, that doesn't mean anything. Just because I have two products that say OPC on board, it does not mean that they're going to talk to one another because of how much of the spec is optional. But more importantly, and Randy Armstrong actually articulates this very well in the certification process. The certification process isn't as stringent in terms of the requirements to be certified, and so it is very possible to have two OPC products that don't talk to one another under UA. So when did you realize, obviously we're not going to rehash what I believe the issues are here. This is a conversation with you, but when did you realize, because you were president up until 18, and then you stayed on a couple more years, and then you left in 2020.
It was time to do something different. Let's put it that way.
When did you realize the foundation was going in the wrong direction?
Well, I was a big believer in collaboration, so I'll take blame for, a lot of the companion specs we started to do, because I was trying to get the information model adopted, right? And I needed to throw and get as many organizations.
So was that an incentive? The idea was that companion specs would create a value proposition to get the information model adopted?
Yeah, it really was.
So that when people were saying, what is the value proposition from going from DA to UA? Why should I invest?
So I started pushing the information model as the main reason for doing this. We were getting the guys embedded to do it, Walker. That was pretty much, I got Rockwell and I got Siemens, to adopt the technology embedded, right? But even those guys, they were using third-party vendors. They weren't doing it natively. I got to know the guys at Softing real well. I mean, Wolfgang Trier, I know him real well for reasons, right? Because, I needed these guys on board to help get the adoption down there. So I started pushing the information model. And the first organization I partnered with was, guess what? I partnered with ISA. Mm-hmm. Okay. And ISA had S95. And that really was our first information model. And there was another organization called Mimosa, and I couldn't spell oil and gas at the time, but I knew I wanted to get oil and gas because, God, if I get these guys on board, right, then it will help. And, and then I participated in the, OPAF, right, which was the guy, and I love the guy, Don Bartusiak real well. I went to him and said, I want to get OPC part of, your standard of what you're doing. And this was an ExxonMobil, Dow, and all the oil companies working together. And we got UA adopted. But also what I learned at that, when I started attending the meetings, I started looking at what we did with Pub Sub, and I met with another company, and they were called Real Time Innovations, okay? And Real Time Innovations was the, really organization, or the company that worked with OMG, and they had the DDS standard. And I kept looking at this and saying, these guys know what Pub Sub is. They've been doing it for 20 years. Right. Okay, we're just starting. So we needed to start thinking about how did we partner with, and, if I would have partnered better with OMG, okay, and, Stan Schneider has reached out to me multiple times, and, we're still good friends. He's, there, and Solely, God rest his soul, he, he's long gone. But, these are the guys that, they wanted to partner with OPC, and I should have made it happen. And we would have, given me an opportunity maybe to get into the medical and the military as well, right? By partnering with the right organization. So Walker, I tried to do these information models for a reason. What we've done now is, or what the foundation done now is, we partnered with too many, and we're not doing enough things to get adoption of the technology.
That's the biggest.
We're spinning off, and it's too fragmented now.
I went through. I spent $100,000 on this, by the way. Over $100,000. I spent over $100,000 on. We basically itemized the entire specification, including all companion specs, and then we went out and tried to find products for each function in the complete UA specification. And we were only able to find products. Now, that doesn't mean, just because we couldn't find the product doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I did spend a significant amount of money on this research. and only about 20% of the OPC specification, the full UA specification, has been adopted. That's crazy to me. It's so nuts that there's all this. I went to Hanover Messe this year.
Yep.
And I walked. They had a huge booth in Building 9, the primary building, and all it was walls with words on it. There was a couple of partners on the outside that were showing like applications. I think 2, but they were like little desktop PCs. There was no. This is application of interoperability using OPC. There was none of that.
You didn't see any of that, no.
It was promises on a wall.
And you look how long this thing's been going on, Walker. It's too long.
The OPC Foundation has lost its way. Could you articulate it? That doesn't mean there aren't wonderful people. Let me qualify here. There are amazing people at the OPC Foundation. There are a lot of people who have dedicated decades of their lives to interoperability in our industry. But my job is to be an advocate for the end user. Like,
Walker, you have to shake things up.
Right.
And this is what's important.
How has the foundation lost its way? If you were to list it if you were to go, here, and here, obviously a focus on application, like getting adoption through application is a primary issue.
Yeah.
But give me 2 other ways that the OPC Foundation has lost its way, in your opinion?
Well, and Walker, the reason that I wanted to engage with you and do some things is, everyone considers me, the godfather or the grandfather of OPC. And, I'm watching this stuff go on, and I'm trying to get, Mitsubishi and some other companies to adopt the OPC UA technology. And, they're all looking at me like, Tom, yeah, we'll do it, but tell me why. Right. And, is there enough significant companies that are going to adopt the technology? And, I work closely with OMAC. I work closely with MT Connect, right? Because Mitsubishi is actively engaged in those. And these guys are still good friends of mine.
Yeah. And by the way, MT Connect is a group that does it right. They
do.
Really do it right. Yeah.
But the OPC UA companion spec for MT Connect is a couple revs out of date.
Yeah.
So it needs to be updated, right? And you need to remember, I told you, you got to keep working on the standards and work with these guys. And, they're like, and I'm working with Sesame as well. And John Dyke and I are really good friends. He's ex-Rockwell. I'm ex-Rockwell. We both live in Cleveland, and, we have lunch together on a regular basis. And, I got Sesame to partner with OPC. And, that was the thing. And, they're doing all their profiles and everything, but they're getting nervous too. And they're getting nervous because, who are the companies, Tom, that are going to go build this stuff, and adopting the technology? So where we lost our, there are companies that have built the technology. The product catalog, needs to be focused on. We need to get the companies, actively promoting this stuff. I did some things with OPC that I don't regret. I mean, it was the right things to do. I added more companies to the board of directors. I was empowered to do that. I did that before I left, because you needed to have, some of these companies on board. I mean, when we brought SAP on board, why do you think I put SAP on the board? And why did I actively get it? Because I needed somebody in the IT world. I needed these guys. I mean, when I first got, a little funny story here, and a guy named Rashesh Modi, he was the CTO for Wonderware at the time, and I needed to show Wonderware's commitment to OPC. And because Wonderware was, they hated OPC. I mean, because they weren't part of the first fold. They hated me. And I won't name the names, but, they hated me at the time. But, finally, I convinced Rashesh Modi. I said, I'm going to make you the CTO of the OPC Foundation. And that was before we had, even knew what a CTO was. Right. And so anytime anybody said, is Wonderware committed? I said, sure, they're committed. The guy who's the CTO of Wonderware is, the CTO of the OPC Foundation. Perfect, right? And I would do the same thing with SAP, right? And say, sure, SAP's committed, Oracle's committed. The problem was, though, Walker, they weren't. We got a bunch of companies on the board, and what needs to be done differently is all these companies. The problem was I also partnered with the Profinet organization in North America.
Right.
The OPC office was based out of Scottsdale, Arizona, which is why I've got a house in Arizona now. Because, I'd go out there all the time, right? And my foundation office was there. But they ran Profinet North America. And they knew how to do, an industry standard and market the crap out of it.
Yeah.
We've lost that ability to market this stuff in outside of Germany.
And one of the fundamental differences between Profinet and OPC is you have lots and lots of it's this weird dichotomy.
Right.
You at the very top you have two primary voices, and then you have too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And then at Profinet's the opposite, the other way around. It's very Profinet's very lean, and there's one or two cooks in the kitchen, and that's it. And so they're able to. That's why the Profinet it's so robust. Is because we talk about this with digital transformation and manufacturers. Yeah. You can't start with your entire team. You have to start with a small team of true believers that can remain agile, that can prove value. Right? It's the same thing in specification
and deliver. Same thing. Yeah.
You left Rockwell in 2005 to run OPC Foundation full time.
Yeah, we needed to do, the guys at Rockwell were like, wait a minute, we're paying your salary to do this thing, and at the time I wasn't sure what I was going to do. Mm-hmm. And I decided, I'm going to go to OPC full time because we really had to have more commitment behind it. And a lesson learned here, Walker.
You're a Rockwell employee. You're a Rockwell employee. That's actually going to hurt. That's going to hurt some relationships.
Exactly. And, when I left OPC, my thought was, and I was grooming Stefan Hoppe. Him and I are good friends, okay?
Right. By the way, I have nothing but the utmost respect for Stefan. He's a wonderful human being.
Right, and I was grooming him to be my replacement. I was going to retire from OPC, do something different. I didn't know what I was going to do when I left OPC. I gave the board, notice I was going to leave and, move on. And so they knew. And then, Russ Agrusa, he said, well, Tom, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know. I don't know what I want to do yet. And he said, well, you're coming to work for me. So, next thing you know, I go to work and I said, well, I don't want to just do Iconics, Russ. I want to do other things. Well, now I've diversified to do a Mitsubishi and CLPA and E-Factory. And now I'm doing more than I've ever done, right? But, it's hard for me to watch OPC as it is right now. You stirred it, and you're not the only one that stirred it, but you were really... I really like what you've done because it needed it. It needed to be stirred, and we got to do something, more dramatic. So when I left OPC, my thought was, when I left Rockwell, I went full-time OPC. OPC paid my salary, and there was no, I was no longer tied to Rockwell. I didn't have to do what Rockwell wanted, right? I would obviously listen to Rockwell and listen to Siemens and listen to all the competitors. Well, the problem, and maybe Stefan needs to make a decision. I thought he's still employed by Beckhoff. Right. And I know Hans Beckhoff really well, and, I'm glad that Beckhoff is committed to, letting Stefan, run OPC full time. But, you got to have a mixture of church and state.
Yeah, and Eric Barnstead's still at Microsoft, and Eric leads like half of the working groups that are active right now. Yeah. He's literally the chair of like half the working groups. And I really do think it hurts the foundation that Stefan is still with Beckhoff and Eric is still with Microsoft.
It really does. It's not only a perception, it's a reality. I mean, Stefan has to do what Hans Beckhoff wants. He may not admit that, but he has to. He has to deliver. And like all the trade shows and things we do, we use Beckhoff as the company for doing all this stuff. You know what? You can't keep. Do you think Profinet does that?
No.
They never do that. They don't go back and have Siemens do all this stuff. They have to run independently. Yeah. And, I never wanted to have a godfather company, Walker. When I started OPC, I didn't have the luxury of having a godfather. So we had to operate lean and mean. We had to do all the right things, and we did it in the right way where, the foundation was receiving enough money, But the companies now, I mean, a bunch of the companies and guys that I've talked to, they're like, Tom, we dropped out of OPC. Mm-hmm. Why do we need to be a member of OPC anymore? And that hurts. and I'm watching that happen, and then I'm watching the struggle. I mean, John Rinaldi is a really good friend of mine. He said, Tom, I don't know what to do with this OPC UA stuff.
He's a legend.
And I'm working with him on a regular basis, right?
Yep.
You need to find some other vendors and that are going to be committed to really adopting the technology.
If
And
you could, if I don't mean
yeah,
to, I'm sorry, but
no, go, please do.
if you could wave a magic wand and pick three things the OPC Foundation should do tomorrow to write the course, and that would be under the theme of we're going to focus on adoption through application. So that means that we have to have the value proposition for the end user and the vendor at the forefront of our mind.
Yep.
If you could wave a magic wand tomorrow under that theme and do three things, what would it be for the foundation?
The OPC Foundation, the way it got structured is the IP is open.
Right.
Anybody can use the IP, and the board.
By the way, that was your vision. That was your
my
vision.
vision, of course.
So thank God you were in charge. Thank God you were in charge. Yes.
Yeah, I did that deliberately. When I went to the board, I said, I'm going to make the specifications available for anybody. What? But that's going to hurt. I said, adoption, guys. Think about adoption. I don't want a roadblock that makes a company have to join the foundation to adopt. We did the same thing with, all the open source. Okay, I made it open to anybody. You don't have to be a member to get it.
Right. You can go to GitHub. You can go to GitHub. You can look at
Right.
source code, code examples. The whole I would say the new leadership since you left they've put up some virtual hurdles and made it a little harder, but that foundation is still there. That concept is
still there. I open certification too. You don't have to be a member to certify, right? But what I'm seeing is if you look at the product catalog, there are so many companies that aren't certifying.
Right.
And when you don't
allow
certify,
that.
You don't have interoperability, Walker.
You can't allow that. I mean, it's crazy. Does Profinet do that? No.
Of course not. You
Of
can't.
course not.
You can't even say you have a product unless it's certified.
That's
with
right.
Profinet and ODVA is the same way. And EtherCAT.
Yes.
It's like So what I would do, I mean, and somebody is going to do this. Somebody's going to take the IP of UA, but it needs to be simplified. We need to simplify this thing, and you need to solve the problems that the end users want. They may not know that they want them, but need to solve the problems that the end users want. You got to start focusing on, marketing this stuff properly, right? And you got to get the suppliers to adopt the technology and to get them to certify.
That's
what has to be done.
Let me throw a couple of ideas out at you or a couple of observations. As I see it, OPC Foundation and OPC UA has a strategic advantage in the market that very few other specifications have for protocols. And
Correct.
That is, it came from the needs of process control. The focus was process control.
Yep.
And for those of you who don't do process control, I'm a controls engineer. That's actually I'm a double E who specializes in industrial controls, did 12 years writing PLC programs initially. There are a lot of considerations that go into firing an output that's going to activate a contactor, that's going to turn a motor on, that's going to run a piece of equipment on the plant floor around people. Okay, there's a lot of considerations about I have to know that connection is always up. I have to know that when I send that command was received, it was executed. I have to get the result back to me. OPC at its core is process control. It is the standard. It has a huge advantage in the market because it has all the pieces you need for safe process control.
Yep.
But in my opinion, the foundation has focused on a lot of things. Like when this whole thing with me and OPC started, when I said, don't use it above L2, it's not appropriate above L2 because it's not lightweight. It's not, I kept laying this whole argument out.
Saying it, right.
And Stefan got mad at me for saying that. He's like, well, no. And Eric Barnstedt got mad at me because in 2016, he basically said Azure IoT is going to be built on OPC. That's what he said. He said there's millions of devices and all this, and he committed to that. And I'm like, well, wait, there's so many better protocols at that level. At that level, there are way better protocols. But at process control, there isn't one. There isn't one that's better. So the foundation, I think, should really go back to its roots.
Exactly.
I
And
think,
focus on process control and focus on what we do best.
and adoption and
Yeah, and
getting
adoption's key. Yeah.
OPC certified and on board on devices. And I don't just mean PLCs. I mean PLCs, industrial PCs that are designed to run on the edge. I mean, Beckoff does a good job with this already, by the way. That's one of the advantages of Stefan being a Beckoff guy. But anything that's in the L2, L1 space, focusing on certification and adoption in L1 and L2. That's what I think they ought to do. And I agree with you. There is so much of the spec I would just throw away. I mean, and by the way, if no one's adopted it, you don't lose anything.
We haven't lost anything.
You haven't lost anything. It's not like
And
someone's going
to what I said before, Walker. You
Yeah.
got to pull forward all the existing OPC. Don't leave that behind. Focus on the companies of what they've adopted of UA and make that stuff really the standard of where we're going to go do.
One of the things I said to Randy Armstrong, love Randy to death, brilliant dude. We were going back and forth on part 14 pub sub. And he said, well, he goes, that thing that you did, that MQTT connector you wrote in Python that's running in a container that you're deploying via Portainer. He goes, you can do that with part 14. And I said, I recognize I can do that with part 14, but why would I?
Why would you do it?
What would be the reason I would do that, Randy? That's what I kept saying over and over again. It's like, and if I'm asking that question, then everyone else is asking the same question.
They're going to ask the same question. So it all goes back to the value proposition, Walker. Didn't mean to. It's exactly what it goes back to. Why would you do it? Yeah,
that's right. So before we close it out, this has been incredibly valuable. I'd love to do a part 2 where maybe we bring the guys from Matricon and Tony Payne from, formerly at Kepware.
And Tony and I are really good friends. We've been good friends forever. When he first got acquired into Kepware, right? And I knew Corky Ellis. I mean, I know all these guys for reasons. And, Arlen and I are good friends, right? And the power of, Sparkplug.
Well, you brought Arlen into the working group for Pub Sub, right?
Yep.
You were the one who invited him in, right?
Yep, I did.
And then in the end, he chose
to. He said, "You guys are going the wrong way, Tom."
Right.
And I respect I respected his opinion.
Yeah. So what do you have going on? What does the next year look like for Tom Burke? And is there
So when I started doing, one of the things I did was when we were doing UA at the end, there were a bunch of vendors that came to me and, they wanted to adopt this thing called TSN, stands for time sensitive networking.
Very important.
And we created this coalition of companies, kind of like when we did the OPC task force. They created their thing called the Shaper Group. And it was really interesting. And it was a lot of companies like ABB and B&R that really had decided they needed a different way. They wanted to deprecate PowerLink, okay? But Siemens, do you think they want to deprecate Profinet? Do you think Rockwell wants to deprecate Ethernet IP or Omron or those things like that? So we created OPC UA over TSN, and Peter Lutzen, I love the guy, and he's running the FLC, which is the effort, to take OPC UA even, down further. But we can't replace Profinet. You can't replace Ethernet IP. And the effort now with FX, is to move, and do more than just controller communication. It's going down. So is that something that OPC should be doing now? Probably not. Okay. So, that needs to be revisited, because if you want to get adoption, you're not going to get the Profinet vendors. I mean, you walk Hanover. Look how many booths had Profinet devices all over the place. Yeah. You think these guys are going to replace it with OPC UA? Is the goal? I mean, maybe I was naive at the time and thought, oh, this is cool. I got ABB and B&R that committed behind it, but it takes a lot more than that. We got to get adoption, Walker.
Yeah.
We got to get adoption of the technology. And maybe some of these VDMA standards, and I love Andreas Farth. Okay, I know him from VDMA, but the standards got to be adopted.
Yeah.
And if they're not adopted and they're not worth the paper they're printed on, what the hell are we doing?
Amen. Well, I mean, what good is the standard if no one's adopting it? And right. I mean, I thought, Matt Paris reached out to me this morning. He was like, "Hey, when's the Tom Burke podcast?" I'm like, "Actually, it's at 11:30 today Central." I said, "Tom and I," he was like, "Man, I have perfect timing." And he sent me one of his articles, and which I had already read, and he, I what I was really thinking. I was like, because when we did our pre-production meeting,
Mm-hmm.
we were talking, how the fact that the standard is actually open and it's open source. So someone could take the standard,
They can take the standard, they can
strip
take
out
the
all
IP.
and get back to its roots, right?
Right.
And it's like, who'd be perfect? It'd be Jeff Schrader. You leading the way as the key voice, but Matt Paris at GE Hire, Jeff Schrader at Highbite,
Mm-hmm.
these guys, they're capable of doing it, or some other group. But I
They
was
can look at
originally
the
thinking,
industry, right? Look
yeah,
at, and look at the industry and do the right thing, right?
right.
And make sure this thing gets adopted. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just all about adoption, and we got to
I
find.
would argue to me, it blows my mind, Tom, that more PLCs don't have OPC servers on board. And you have to ask the question, why?
They should.
And now, granted, I default to Kepware. I mean,
Yeah.
to me, it's just automatic. It always works for me. It's like I set it and forget it. I'm going to do my data acquisition through Kep server, and then it's going to serve to me over OPC UA. I don't even use the IoT gateway. If they adopted Sparkplug B, I would, but because they don't have Sparkplug B, I don't even use the IoT gateway in most applications. I'm really just using the OPC server, and then I put a gateway in between that converts everything OPC UA information models and namespaces into MQTT namespaces to get past L2.
Right.
But
Exactly.
I would love to see a stripped down standard that would be easily adopted in edge devices.
Yeah.
Easily adopted. Low barrier to entry. I remember when Easy Automation, they have the Easy Rack PLC. And when Easy Automation, they have an OPC server on board, but you got to pay an additional license to activate the server.
Yeah.
And they worked with Arlen Nipper over one night. I remember they wrote the new firmware to add in Sparkplug B support, MQTT, flat MQTT, and Sparkplug support in one night.
They did it very, very, like you just said, they did it quickly. And why were they able to do it quickly? Because it was simple.
It was simple. What is it? 68 pages, or it's a short standard. It's a very short standard. All right, with that, Tom, dude, I honestly, it's an honor. You're a legend in the industry.
Thank you. So are you.
I appreciate it. But I was honestly honored that you reached out to have this conversation with me. I can't thank you enough, because I think this is long overdue. It says a lot. Your voice carries a lot of weight. And at the end of the day, all I care about is manufacturers. I care about middle class and manufacturing in the United States. That's what I care about. And this is you serving manufacturers. And I'm incredibly grateful for you, brother. All right, with that, thank you guys for watching. For those of you watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, comment down below. We will have a follow-up podcast with Tom. We're going to try and schedule one with Tom and a couple other players in the OPC world. Also, we are finalizing Tom's speaking engagement at Prove It, so you guys will get a chance to meet him next February here in Dallas, Texas. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, comment down below. We'll see you in the next one.